The morning sun was just starting to peek through the clouds as 12-year-old Tyler walked through the busy airport terminal. His backpack felt heavy on his shoulders, not because of the books inside, but because of the butterflies dancing in his stomach. This was his first time flying alone, and he was both excited and nervous about seeing his dad after 3 whole months. Tyler's grandmother had packed his favorite snacks and reminded him at least 5 times to be polite and respectful to everyone. She always said those words whenever he went somewhere important. "Remember, baby, you represent our family wherever you go," she had whispered while hugging him goodbye at the security checkpoint. At the gate, Tyler checked his boarding pass for the 100th time. Seat 2A, first class. His dad had surprised him with the upgrade, saying his little man deserved to travel in style. Tyler had never been in first class before, and he wondered what it would be like. Would the seats be as big as his bed at home? Would they really bring him warm cookies like in the movies? When boarding began, Tyler waited patiently in line with the other first-class passengers. He noticed how different they looked from him. Most were wearing expensive suits or designer clothes, carrying leather briefcases and talking loudly on their phones about business deals and meetings. Tyler looked down at his simple jeans and his favorite superhero t-shirt. For a moment, he wondered if he belonged there. The gate agent scanned Tyler's boarding pass with a smile. "Have a wonderful flight, young man," she said warmly. Tyler felt his confidence return as he walked down the jet bridge toward the plane. The flight attendant at the door greeted the passengers with practiced enthusiasm. "Welcome aboard Flight 447 to Los Angeles," she announced to each person entering. When Tyler reached her, he showed his boarding pass proudly. "First class is to your right, sweetheart," she said, without really looking at him. Tyler nodded and turned right, his heart beating faster with excitement. The first-class cabin was everything he had imagined and more. The seats were huge and covered in soft leather. There were only a few rows, and each seat had its own little television screen and a small table. Tyler found his seat by the window and carefully placed his backpack in the overhead compartment, just like his dad had taught him during their practice runs at home. As Tyler settled into his seat, he pulled out the book his grandmother had given him. It was about a young boy who became a pilot and flew all around the world helping people in different countries. Tyler loved stories about adventure and dreamed of traveling to far-off places someday. The plane was filling up quickly, and Tyler watched as other passengers found their seats. A businessman in an expensive suit sat across the aisle from him, already typing away on his laptop. An elderly lady with pearl earrings took the seat behind him, chatting quietly with her husband about their upcoming vacation. Tyler was just getting comfortable when he noticed one of the flight attendants walking toward him. She was a middle-aged woman with blonde hair pulled back tightly and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her name tag read Ms. Johnson. "Excuse me, honey," she said, stopping beside Tyler's seat. "I think there might be some confusion here. Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Tyler looked up from his book, confused. "Yes, ma'am, this is 2A, see?" He held up his boarding pass, pointing to the seat number printed clearly on the paper. Ms. Johnson took the boarding pass and studied it carefully, her eyebrows raising slightly. This does say first class," she said slowly. "But are you traveling with your parents? Where are they sitting?" "I'm flying by myself to see my dad in Los Angeles," Tyler explained politely. "He bought me this ticket." The flight attendant's expression changed subtly. She looked around the first-class cabin, then back at Tyler. "Well, sometimes there are mistakes with seat assignments, especially for unaccompanied minors. Let me just double-check this with the gate agent." Tyler felt his stomach drop. "But my dad specifically bought me a first-class ticket. He wanted me to be comfortable on the long flight." "I'm sure he did, sweetie," Ms. Johnson said. But her tone suggested she didn't quite believe him. "But we need to make sure everything is correct. These seats are very expensive, and we want to make sure there wasn't an error in the booking system." Other passengers were starting to notice the conversation. Tyler could feel their eyes on him, and his cheeks began to burn with embarrassment. He had done nothing wrong, but somehow he felt like he was in trouble. "The gate agent already checked my boarding pass when I got on the plane," Tyler said quietly. hoping to resolve the situation quickly. She said it was fine. Ms. Johnson seemed to consider this for a moment, but then shook her head. Well, I still need to verify this. Company policy, you understand. Let me make a quick call to the desk. Tyler watched as she walked away, speaking into her phone in hushed tones. He tried to focus on his book, but the words seemed to blur together on the page. Around him, other passengers were settling in for the flight, storing their belongings and adjusting their seats. The businessman across the aisle glanced at Tyler with what looked like sympathy, but said nothing. After what felt like forever, Ms. Johnson returned with another flight attendant, a younger man with kind eyes. "This is Supervisor Rodriguez," she announced. "He's going to help us sort this out." Mr. Rodriguez looked at Tyler's boarding pass and then at his tablet. "Everything looks correct here," he said after a moment. "The ticket was purchased properly and the boy is listed as an unaccompanied minor in first class." Tyler felt relief wash over him. Finally, someone understood that he belonged there. But Ms. Johnson wasn't satisfied. "Are you absolutely certain? It just seems unusual for a child to be traveling alone in first class. Maybe we should move him to coach where he'll be closer to other families." Tyler's heart sank again. "But I want to stay here," he said softly. "My dad bought this seat for me specifically." Mr. Rodriguez looked uncomfortable. "Well, the ticket is valid, but if Ms. Johnson thinks the child would be more comfortable in coach, I would be more comfortable staying where my dad put me," Tyler said, trying to keep his voice steady. He could feel tears threatening to come, but he remembered his grandmother's words about being strong and respectful. Ms. Johnson seemed to make up her mind. "I think it's best if we move you to coach. There's a nice seat available in the middle of the plane where you'll have more families around you. It's really better for children." Before Tyler could protest further, she was already reaching for his backpack. "Come on, honey, let's get you settled in your new seat." Tyler looked around the first-class cabin one more time. The businessman was shaking his head slightly, and the elderly lady behind him was whispering something to her husband that sounded disapproving. But no one spoke up for him. With his cheeks burning and his eyes threatening to overflow, Tyler followed Ms. Johnson toward the back of the plane. He clutched his boarding pass tightly, the proof that he belonged in first class. But somehow it didn't matter anymore. As they walked through the plane, Tyler could feel the stares of other passengers. Some looked curious, others seemed uncomfortable, and a few appeared sympathetic, but their silence felt heavy, and Tyler realized that sometimes being right wasn't enough. The coach seat Ms. Johnson found for him was between a snoring businessman and a mother with a crying baby. It was cramped and uncomfortable. Nothing like the spacious first-class seat his father had carefully chosen for him. Tyler buckled his seatbelt and tried to focus on his book, but the words kept swimming in front of his eyes. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Tyler pressed his face against the small window and wondered why he had been made to move when his ticket was perfectly valid. He thought about his dad, who worked so hard and saved money to make sure Tyler could travel comfortably. He thought about his grandmother, who always told him to be proud of who he was. Most of all, Tyler thought about how different he looked from the other first-class passengers, and wondered if that was the real reason Ms. Johnson had decided he didn't belong there. The thought made his stomach hurt in a way that had nothing to do with flying. Dr. Michael Thompson checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. Flight 447 had landed 20 minutes ago, and passengers should be coming through the arrival gate any moment now. He straightened his tie and smoothed down his jacket, wanting to look his best for Tyler. It had been 3 long months since he'd seen his son, and every day apart felt like an eternity. Michael had been looking forward to this visit for weeks. He'd planned special activities for Tyler's stay, a trip to the beach, visits to the Science Museum, and maybe even a Lakers game if he could get tickets. Most importantly, he'd bought Tyler a first-class ticket because he wanted his son to feel special and comfortable on the long flight from Atlanta. The arrival board showed that Flight 447 had arrived on time, so Michael positioned himself where Tyler would easily spot him. He held a small sign with Tyler's name on it, even though it wasn't necessary. It was something they'd joked about during their video calls. Michael pretending to be a professional driver picking up an important client. Passengers began streaming through the arrival gate. First came the business travelers with their rolling suitcases and tired expressions. Then families with children, looking disheveled after the long flight. Michael scanned each face, looking for Tyler's bright smile and excited wave. But when Tyler finally appeared, something was wrong. The boy walked slowly, his shoulders slumped and his eyes focused on the ground. There was no excited run toward his father, no big grin, no enthusiastic hug. Instead, Tyler approached quietly, almost reluctantly. "Hey, buddy," Michael called out, opening his arms wide. "There's my favorite co-pilot." Tyler managed a small smile and accepted his father's hug, but Michael could immediately tell something had happened. His son's usual energy was completely gone, replaced by a quietness that felt heavy and sad. "How was the flight?" Michael asked, as they walked toward baggage claim. "Did you like flying first class? Were the seats as big as we thought they'd be?" Tyler's step faltered slightly. "It was okay," he said quietly, not meeting his father's eyes. Michael felt a knot forming in his stomach. In all their phone conversations leading up to this trip, Tyler had been bouncing with excitement about flying first class for the first time. This subdued response was completely unlike his normally chatty son. "Just okay?" Michael pressed gently. "What about those warm cookies they serve in first class? And the big TV screens?" Tyler shrugged. "I guess." They collected Tyler's suitcase, in uncomfortable silence. Michael kept glancing at his son, trying to figure out what could have happened to change his mood so dramatically. Had Tyler gotten airsick? Was he just tired from the flight? Or was something more serious going on? During the drive home, Michael tried several times to engage Tyler in conversation. He asked about school, about Tyler's friends, about his grandmother, but every response was short and lifeless. Tyler spent most of the ride staring out the window, lost in his own thoughts. When they arrived at Michael's apartment, Tyler went straight to the guest room that had been prepared especially for him. Michael had spent hours making it perfect. New sheets, Tyler's favorite snacks on the bedside table, and a stack of books he thought his son would enjoy. "Are you hungry?" Michael called through the partially closed door. "We could order pizza from that place you like." "I'm not really hungry," Tyler replied, his voice muffled. Michael stood in the hallway, worried and confused. This wasn't the reunion he'd been dreaming about for months. Something had clearly upset Tyler, but getting information out of a 12-year-old who didn't want to talk was like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. After giving Tyler some space to settle in, Michael knocked gently on the bedroom door. "Can I come in?" Tyler was sitting on the bed, still in his travel clothes, staring at his hands. "I guess." Michael sat down beside his son, careful not to crowd him. As a lawyer, he'd learned that sometimes the best way to get information was to be patient and create a safe space for people to open up. "Tyler, I can tell something's bothering you," he said softly. "You don't seem like yourself. Did something happen on the flight?" Tyler's shoulders tensed, and Michael saw his son's jaw tighten in a way that reminded him painfully of himself when he was trying not to cry. "It's nothing," Tyler mumbled. "Son, I've been looking forward to this visit for months. I was expecting to see you run through that airport gate with a huge smile, ready to tell me all about your first-class adventure. Instead, you look like someone stole your favorite toy. That's not nothing." Tyler remained silent, but Michael could see tears gathering in his son's eyes. "Whatever happened, you can tell me," Michael continued. "I'm your dad. It's my job to listen and to help fix things when they go wrong." For a long moment, Tyler said nothing. Then, in a voice so quiet Michael had to strain to hear it, Tyler said, "They made me move." "Made you move? Move where?" "From first class to coach." Tyler's voice cracked slightly. "The flight attendant said I didn't belong there." Michael felt his blood pressure spike, but he kept his voice calm. "Tell me exactly what happened." The story came out slowly, in bits and pieces. Tyler described how excited he'd been to sit in first class, how he'd shown his boarding pass to prove he belonged there, and how the flight attendant had insisted there must be some mistake. He told his father about the stares from other passengers, the embarrassment of being escorted to the back of the plane, and the crushing feeling that he wasn't good enough for the seat his father had purchased for him. With each detail, Michael felt his anger growing. But he also felt something else, a deep aching sadness for his son's lost innocence. Tyler was learning a harsh lesson about the world that no 12-year-old should have to face. "Did she give you a reason?" Michael asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Did she say why she thought there was a mistake?" Tyler shrugged. "She said it was unusual for a kid to be in first class alone. But Dad, there were other kids on the plane traveling by themselves. I saw them, but they didn't move those kids." Michael closed his eyes for a moment, recognizing the ugly truth behind what had happened to his son. As a civil rights attorney, he'd handled dozens of cases involving discrimination. He knew the subtle ways it could manifest, the coded language people used, the supposedly reasonable explanations that masked underlying bias. "Tyler, look at me," Michael said gently. His son raised his eyes, and Michael could see the hurt and confusion there. "What happened to you was wrong. Completely wrong. You had every right to be in that seat because I bought that ticket for you specifically. The flight attendant had no business moving you." "But maybe she was just trying to be helpful," Tyler said, though his voice suggested he didn't really believe it. "No, son. If she was trying to be helpful, she would have called me to verify the purchase, or she would have contacted the airline directly. She wouldn't have moved you to a smaller, less comfortable seat. She definitely wouldn't have done it in front of other passengers in a way that made you feel embarrassed." Tyler nodded slowly, and Michael could see some of the weight lifting from his son's shoulders. "I keep thinking about all those people watching," Tyler said quietly. "Some of them looked like they felt bad for me, but nobody said anything. Nobody stood up for me." Michael pulled his son into a tight hug. "I'm sorry that happened to you. I'm sorry I wasn't there to protect you. And I'm sorry that some people in this world will treat you differently because of how you look." They sat together in silence for a while, Tyler finally allowing himself to cry the tears he'd been holding back since the flight. Michael rubbed his son's back and made a silent promise that this wouldn't be the end of the story. When Tyler's tears subsided, Michael asked, "Do you remember the flight attendant's name?" "Ms. Johnson, I think. It was on her name tag." Michael nodded grimly. "Tyler, I want you to know that what happened to you isn't your fault, and it's not something you should just accept. Sometimes when people do wrong things, they need to face consequences so they don't do those same wrong things to other kids." "What are you going to do?" Tyler asked. "I'm going to make some phone calls," Michael said simply, "starting with the airline." That evening, after Tyler had finally eaten some dinner and was watching a movie in the living room, Michael called the airline's customer service line. He was transferred 3 times before reaching someone who claimed to be a supervisor. "I'd like to file a formal complaint about the treatment my son received on Flight 447 today," Michael began, keeping his voice professional but firm. The supervisor, who identified herself as Mrs. Rodriguez, listened politely as Michael described the incident. When he finished, there was a brief pause before she responded. "I'm sorry your son was inconvenienced, Mr. Thompson. Sometimes there are legitimate safety concerns when unaccompanied minors are seated in certain areas of the aircraft." "Safety concerns?" Michael repeated, his jaw tightening. "What safety concerns could possibly exist in first class that don't exist in coach?" "Well, unaccompanied minors are sometimes better supervised when seated closer to our crew stations. Mrs. Rodriguez, my son had a valid first-class ticket. He was moved not for safety reasons, but because your flight attendant made an assumption about whether he belonged there. This is discrimination, plain and simple." Part 3. The investigation begins. Expanded story. The next morning, Dr. Michael Thompson sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open and a steaming cup of coffee beside him. Tyler was still sleeping, exhausted from the emotional toll of the previous day. Michael had barely slept himself, his mind racing with questions and a growing determination to get answers. He started with the basics. Opening his browser, he searched for information about Ms. Johnson, the flight attendant who had moved Tyler. It didn't take long to find what he was looking for. The airline's employee directory showed Linda Johnson had been with the company for 8 years, working primarily on domestic routes. But it was what Michael found next that made his coffee grow cold. Using his legal research skills, Michael accessed public complaint databases and employment records. What he discovered painted a troubling picture. Over the past 2 years, Linda Johnson's name appeared in connection with multiple passenger complaints, and they all followed a disturbing pattern. The first complaint came from the Williams family 18 months ago. Their teenage son had been questioned about his right to sit in business class, despite having a valid ticket purchased by his parents. The complaint described how the flight attendant had made the family feel uncomfortable and unwelcome throughout the flight. 6 months later, another complaint. A young woman traveling for a job interview had been asked repeatedly to show her boarding pass and identification, while other passengers in first class were left alone. The woman wrote that she felt singled out and humiliated by the experience. Then, there was the Martinez family's complaint from last spring. Their 10-year-old daughter, traveling alone to visit her grandmother, had been moved from her assigned seat to the back of the plane. The reason given? The flight attendant thought she would be more comfortable with other families. Michael leaned back in his chair, feeling sick to his stomach. Tyler wasn't the first child this had happened to. He was just the latest in a series of incidents that the airline had apparently ignored or brushed aside with form letter apologies. His phone rang, interrupting his research. It was his law partner, David Chen. "Mike, you sound terrible," David said after Michael's groggy hello. "Everything okay? Isn't Tyler supposed to be visiting this week?" Michael explained what had happened to Tyler on the flight. David listened without interrupting, his occasional sharp intakes of breath the only indication of his growing anger. "That's absolutely unacceptable," David said when Michael finished. "What did the airline say when you called?" "Standard corporate response. They're looking into it, and I should expect a response in a week or 2. David, I've been digging into this flight attendant's history, and Tyler isn't the first kid she's done this to." "How many others?" "At least 3 documented complaints in the past 2 years, probably more that were never formally reported. And David, they all have something in common." There was silence on the other end of the line as David processed the implication. "Mike, you know what this means, right? This isn't just about Tyler anymore. This is about a pattern of discrimination that the airline has allowed to continue." Michael nodded even though David couldn't see him. "I know. The question is, what are we going to do about it?" "We're going to do what we do best," David replied firmly. "We're going to get justice for these kids and make sure it doesn't happen again." After hanging up, Michael continued his research. He reached out to his network of contacts in the legal community, particularly those who specialized in civil rights cases. What he learned made his determination even stronger. Flight attendant. Linda Johnson had started her career with excellent reviews. Her early performance evaluations praised her customer service skills and professionalism. But something had changed about 3 years ago. Her reviews became more mixed, with occasional notes about passenger relations issues and communication challenges. More importantly, Michael discovered that several supervisors had noted complaints about Johnson's treatment of certain passengers, but no serious disciplinary action had ever been taken. She'd received a few warnings and was required to attend some additional training sessions, but she continued working the same routes with the same authority to make decisions about passenger seating. Michael picked up his phone and called Rebecca Martinez, the mother whose daughter had been moved from her assigned seat the previous spring. It took some convincing for her to talk to him, but when she understood that Tyler had experienced something similar, she opened up. "I was so angry," Rebecca told him. "My daughter had been so excited about that flight. We'd saved up money to buy her a good seat so she'd be comfortable visiting her abuela. But that flight attendant made her feel like she didn't deserve to be there." "Did you file a complaint?" Michael asked. "Of course I did. I called and wrote letters. They sent me a generic apology and a $50 travel voucher." $50. Like that would make up for my daughter coming off that plane in tears. Michael felt his jaw clench. "Rebecca, would you be willing to speak with me more about this? I'm building a case, and I think your daughter's experience is part of a larger pattern." You really think you can do something about it? Rebecca asked, hope creeping into her voice. Because I've felt helpless about this for months. My daughter still gets nervous about flying. I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure this doesn't happen to any more children, Michael promised. Over the next few days, Michael reached out to other families who had filed similar complaints. Not all of them were willing to talk, but those who did painted a consistent picture. Linda Johnson had a habit of questioning certain passengers right to their seats, often using language about safety or comfort to justify moving them to less desirable locations. What made Michael's blood boil was the airline's response to these complaints. In every case, they had offered minimal compensation and vague promises to review the matter. But clearly, no meaningful review had taken place, because Johnson continued her pattern of behavior. Michael also discovered something else troubling. The airline's training programs for dealing with discrimination complaints were woefully inadequate. A leaked internal document showed that flight attendants received less than 2 hours of anti-bias training during their initial certification, with no regular refresher courses required. Even more damaging was an internal email chain that Michael's contacts helped him obtain through legal channels. In one exchange between airline supervisors, Johnson's behavior was discussed openly. One supervisor wrote, "Linda seems to have strong opinions about who belongs where on the plane, but her passenger complaints are still within acceptable limits." Acceptable limits. Michael stared at those words on his computer screen, feeling a rage he hadn't experienced since his early days as a civil rights lawyer. The airline knew they had a problem employee, but as long as she didn't generate too many complaints, they were willing to let her continue humiliating children and their families. Michael began building what lawyers call a pattern and practice case. This wasn't just about one incident involving Tyler. It was about a systematic failure by the airline to address known discriminatory behavior by their employee. He reached out to civil rights organizations, sharing his findings and asking for their support. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Organizations that fought discrimination in various forms offered their resources and expertise to help build the case. One particularly helpful contact was attorney Patricia Williams, who had spent her career fighting discrimination in the transportation industry. When Michael called her, she listened to Tyler's story and the evidence he'd gathered about other incidents. "Michael, what you've uncovered is exactly the kind of institutional discrimination that we've been fighting for decades," Patricia told him. "The airline created an environment where this behavior was tolerated and children suffered as a result. That's not just a customer service problem. It's a civil rights violation." "What's our best approach?" Michael asked. "We need to document everything. Every complaint, every internal communication, every piece of evidence that shows the airline knew about this problem and failed to address it. We also need to be prepared for them to fight back hard. Airlines have deep pockets and expensive lawyers." Michael smiled grimly. "Good thing I have some experience with expensive lawyers." As his investigation continued, Michael made another disturbing discovery. Linda Johnson wasn't the only airline employee with multiple discrimination complaints. The airline industry, as a whole, had been struggling with these issues for years. But individual cases were often settled quietly with non-disclosure agreements that prevented families from speaking publicly about their experiences. This culture of silence meant that discriminatory behavior continued unchecked, with airline employees facing few consequences for their actions. Families were paid small amounts of money to keep quiet, while the underlying problems were never addressed. Michael realized that Tyler's case could be different. As a successful civil rights attorney, he had the resources and expertise to fight a prolonged legal battle. More importantly, he had the motivation that only a parent whose child has been wronged can possess. But this wasn't just about revenge or even justice for Tyler. 6 months had passed since Tyler's humiliating flight experience, and Dr. Michael Thompson was ready to strike. His law office buzzed with activity as his team prepared to file what would become one of the most significant discrimination lawsuits in airline industry history. Michael stood at the conference room window watching the morning traffic below. Behind him, boxes of evidence lined the walls. witness statements, internal airline documents, complaint records, and expert testimonies. What had started as a father's quest for justice had grown into something much larger. "Are you ready for this?" asked David Chen, his law partner, as he entered the room carrying fresh coffee and a stack of morning newspapers. Michael turned from the window, his expression determined. "I've been ready since the day my son came off that plane in tears." The lawsuit they were about to file wasn't just against the airline. It was against the entire system that had allowed Tyler and other children to be treated as second-class citizens simply because of how they looked. Michael had learned that this problem went far deeper than one flight attendant's bad behavior. At exactly 9 a.m., Michael and his legal team walked into the federal courthouse. Reporters were already gathering outside, having gotten word that a major civil rights case was about to be filed. The story had begun to leak over the past few weeks, and media interest was growing. Inside the courthouse, Michael filed a lawsuit seeking $15 million in damages from both the airline and Linda Johnson personally. But the money wasn't the real goal. It was the sweeping changes he was demanding that would really matter. The lawsuit outlined a pattern of discrimination that went back years. Michael's investigation had uncovered 12 separate incidents involving Linda Johnson alone, and evidence suggested similar problems with other airline employees. The airline had received complaint after complaint, but had done almost nothing to address the underlying issues. What made this case particularly powerful was the evidence Michael had gathered about the airline's internal communications. Email chains between supervisors showed they were aware of Johnson's problematic behavior, but had chosen to ignore it as long as complaints stayed within acceptable limits. One particularly damaging email, written by a senior airline executive, dismissed passenger complaints as isolated incidents and suggested that some people are just more sensitive about these things. Michael knew that email alone would be worth millions in court. By noon, news of the lawsuit was spreading across social media. The hashtag Justice for Tyler began trending as parents shared their own stories of discrimination their children had faced while traveling. The response was overwhelming and immediate. Tyler's story resonated with families across the country. Parents posted photos of their children who had experienced similar treatment, and many shared stories that had never been reported to authorities. The airline's customer service phone lines were flooded with calls as people demanded answers. Michael's phone rang constantly with interview requests from news networks, radio stations, and newspapers. He had expected media attention, but nothing like this. The story was striking a nerve with parents everywhere who saw their own children in Tyler's experience. "Dad, there are reporters outside our house," Tyler said when he called Michael from his grandmother's place in Atlanta. The family had decided to keep Tyler away from Los Angeles until the initial media frenzy died down. "I know, buddy. Are you okay with all this attention?" Michael asked, concerned about how the publicity might affect his son. "I think so," Tyler replied thoughtfully. "Grandma showed me some of the messages people are sending. A lot of kids are saying thank you because someone is finally standing up for them." That evening, Michael appeared on the national news to discuss the case. The interview was scheduled for 5 minutes but ran nearly 15 as the anchor asked detailed questions about the evidence and what Michael hoped to achieve. "This isn't about getting rich or getting revenge," Michael explained to the television audience. "This is about making sure that no child ever again has to experience what my son went through. We're asking the court to force real changes in how airlines train their employees and handle discrimination complaints." The airline's response came the next morning in the form of a tersely worded press release. They denied any discrimination had occurred and claimed that their employee had been following standard safety protocols. They suggested that Tyler's father was exploiting a minor misunderstanding for financial gain. That response backfired spectacularly. Parents who might have given the airline the benefit of the doubt were outraged by the suggestion that Tyler's experience was just a minor misunderstanding. Social media erupted with criticism of the airline's tone-deaf response. By the end of the week, organized boycotts were forming. Travel bloggers and family websites urged their readers to choose other airlines. Several prominent celebrities posted on social media about their intention to avoid the airline until changes were made. The airline's stock price began dropping as investors worried about the long-term impact of the controversy. Financial analysts appeared on business news shows discussing whether the airline had underestimated the public relations damage the case could cause. Michael received a call from one of the airline's lawyers 3 weeks after filing the lawsuit. Attorney Robert Kellerman represented some of the biggest corporations in the country and was known for his aggressive tactics in defending discrimination cases. "Mr. Thompson, I think we can resolve this matter quickly and quietly," Kellerman said during their phone conversation. "My client is prepared to offer a generous settlement to make this go away." "How generous?" Michael asked, though he was already pretty sure he would reject whatever offer they made. $200,000, plus a written apology from the flight attendant. In exchange, you drop the lawsuit and sign a non-disclosure agreement. Michael almost laughed. "Mr. Kellerman, you clearly don't understand what this case is about. This isn't going away for $200,000 and an apology that nobody will ever see." "What exactly do you want?" Kellerman asked, his tone becoming less friendly. "I want your client to admit they allowed discrimination to continue unchecked. I want real changes to their training programs. I want oversight to ensure these problems don't happen again. And I want other families to know that this kind of behavior has consequences." "That's not going to happen," Kellerman replied firmly. "My client will fight this case to the end before admitting to systematic discrimination." "Then I guess we'll see you in court," Michael said before hanging up. The airline's refusal to negotiate seriously only strengthened Michael's resolve. He began preparing for a prolonged legal battle, knowing that the airline would use every resource at their disposal to fight the case. Congressional attention came sooner than Michael had expected. Representative Angela Washington, who chaired the House Transportation Committee, announced that she would be holding hearings on discrimination in the airline industry. Tyler's case had highlighted a problem that lawmakers could no longer ignore. "The humane treatment of young Tyler Thompson is absolutely unacceptable," Representative Washington said during a press conference. "But based on the evidence that's come to light, this appears to be part of a much larger pattern that demands congressional action." The announcement of congressional hearings sent the airline's stock price down another 5%. Executives, who had initially thought they could weather the storm from Tyler's case, were beginning to realize they faced a much bigger problem. Internal documents that Michael obtained through legal discovery showed panic in the airline's executive ranks. Email chains revealed discussions about whether to settle the case quickly or continue fighting. Some executives worried that fighting would only generate more negative publicity. One leaked email from the airline's CEO to his board of directors was particularly revealing. "The Thompson case has opened a can of worms that threatens our entire operation. We're facing not just a lawsuit, but a public relations nightmare that could take years to recover from." Michael knew the airline was feeling the pressure, but he also knew they weren't ready to give him what he really wanted: meaningful change that would protect other children. The real battle was just beginning. As the case gained national attention, Michael began hearing from civil rights organizations around the country. The NAACP offered their support, as did several other groups that fought discrimination in various forms. Legal experts began calling Tyler's case a potential landmark that could reshape how transportation companies handle civil rights issues. The pressure on the airline continued to mount. Travel industry publications ran articles questioning whether other airlines might face similar scrutiny. Flight attendant unions issued statements distancing themselves from discriminatory behavior while calling for better training programs. Michael felt cautiously optimistic about the momentum building behind Tyler's case, but he also knew that powerful corporations didn't give up easily, especially when admitting wrongdoing could open them up to additional lawsuits from other affected families. The real test would come when they finally got to court. Michael was confident in his evidence and his legal arguments, but he also knew that the airline would bring their best lawyers and every resource. 18 months after Tyler's humiliating flight experience, Dr. Michael Thompson stood in the marble lobby of the federal courthouse, surrounded by news cameras and reporters. Today was the day that would change everything, not just for Tyler, but for countless children who would fly in the years to come. The legal battle had been long and exhausting. The airline had fought every step of the way, hiring expensive lawyers and trying to discredit Tyler's story. They'd spent millions of dollars on legal fees, all to avoid admitting they had a discrimination problem. But Michael had been relentless, and the evidence was overwhelming. Just that morning, the airline's lawyers had called with a settlement offer that finally acknowledged the seriousness of what had happened. $15 million plus the sweeping policy changes Michael had been demanding from the beginning. It was more than he had dared to hope for when this all started. "Dad, are you nervous?" Tyler asked as they walked toward the courthouse, steps where Michael would announce the settlement. At 13, Tyler had grown taller and more confident over the past year and a half. The shy, hurt boy who had been moved from first class was now a young man who spoke confidently about his experience and why change was necessary. "A little," Michael admitted. "But mostly I'm proud. Proud of you for being brave enough to tell your story, and proud that we didn't give up when things got difficult." The settlement terms were everything Michael had fought for. The airline agreed to pay $15 million, not just to Tyler's family, but to establish a foundation that would monitor discrimination in the travel industry and provide legal support to other victims. It was money that would keep working for justice long after Tyler's case was over, but the money was only part of the victory. The real change came in the form of new policies that the airline was required to implement immediately. Linda Johnson had been terminated 6 months earlier, when internal documents revealed the full extent of her discriminatory behavior. She faced personal legal consequences that would follow her for years, making it nearly impossible for her to work in the aviation industry again. More importantly, her firing sent a clear message to other airline employees that discrimination would no longer be tolerated. The airline was required to completely overhaul their employee training programs. Instead of the 2-hour anti-bias training they had been providing, employees would now receive 40 hours of comprehensive education on civil rights, unconscious bias, and proper procedures for handling passenger concerns. This training would be repeated annually, with regular testing to ensure employees understood their responsibilities. A new oversight committee was established, with independent members who had no connection to the airline. This committee would review every discrimination complaint and had the power to recommend disciplinary action when problems were found. No longer could complaints be brushed aside with form letter apologies. The airline also agreed to publish annual reports on discrimination complaints, showing the public exactly how many incidents occurred and what actions were taken in response. This transparency would make it impossible for them to ignore patterns of problematic behavior in the future. Perhaps most importantly, the settlement created a scholarship fund for underprivileged children to experience air travel. The fund would pay for first-class tickets for kids who had never flown before, giving them the same comfortable experience that Tyler should have had on his original flight. As Michael approached the microphones on the courthouse steps, he thought about all the families who had contacted him over the past year, parents who had watched their children face similar discrimination, but who had felt powerless to fight back against a large corporation. Their stories had kept him motivated during the darkest moments of the legal battle. "Today marks the end of a long journey for my family," Michael began, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd of reporters and supporters. "But it's also the beginning of a new chapter in how our transportation system treats all passengers with dignity and respect." The crowd included many of the families whose children had experienced discrimination similar to Tyler's. Rebecca Martinez was there with her daughter Sophia, who had been moved from her assigned seat 2 years earlier. The Williams family had driven from Phoenix to be present for the announcement. These families had become like extended family to Tyler and Michael during the legal process. "This case was never about getting rich or getting revenge," Michael continued. "It was about making sure that no child would ever again have to experience the shame and confusion that my son felt when he was told he didn't belong in the seat we had purchased for him." Tyler stepped forward to speak, something he had insisted on doing despite his father's concerns about the media attention. Over the past year, Tyler had found his voice and become an eloquent advocate for other children facing discrimination. "When that flight attendant moved me from first class, I felt like there was something wrong with me," Tyler said, his voice steady and clear. "I wondered if I really did belong there, even though my dad had bought me that ticket. But I learned that the problem wasn't with me. It was with a system that allowed people to treat kids differently based on how they looked. The airline's CEO, who had initially dismissed Tyler's case as a minor misunderstanding, was not present for the settlement announcement. He had resigned 3 months earlier as the company's stock price continued to suffer from the negative publicity surrounding the case. The new CEO, Patricia Rodriguez, had been brought in specifically to repair the airline's damaged reputation. She had reached out to Michael personally to negotiate the settlement terms and had committed to making the changes a genuine priority, rather than just a legal requirement. "We failed Tyler Thompson and other young passengers," Rodriguez had said during their private meeting. "That failure stops today. These changes aren't just about legal compliance, they're about becoming the kind of company that treats every passenger with dignity." The congressional hearings that had been triggered by Tyler's case had led to broader legislation affecting the entire airline industry. New federal requirements for anti-discrimination training were being implemented across all major airlines, not just the one that had discriminated against Tyler. The ripple effects extended beyond aviation. Hotels, restaurants, and other businesses in the travel industry began reviewing their own policies and training programs, worried that they might face similar scrutiny if discrimination incidents occurred. Michael's law firm had been contacted by families from around the country who had experienced similar discrimination in various settings. The success of Tyler's case had shown that it was possible to fight back against institutional discrimination and win meaningful change. 6 months. After the settlement, Michael received an invitation that brought tears to his eyes. The first children to receive scholarships from Tyler's foundation were taking their inaugural flights, and the airline wanted Tyler to be there to meet them. At the airport, Tyler watched as 8 children from low-income families prepared to experience first-class air travel for the first time. Their excitement reminded him of how he had felt before his original flight, full of wonder and anticipation. "Are you really going to make sure we can stay in our seats?" asked 10-year-old Aisha, who was flying to visit her grandfather in Florida. "Absolutely," Tyler replied with a smile. "Those seats are yours, and nobody has the right to make you move." The flight attendants on this special flight had all completed the new anti-discrimination training. They went out of their way to make each child feel welcome and special, bringing them extra snacks and showing them how all the first-class amenities worked. Michael watched from the gate as the children boarded the plane, their faces glowing with excitement. This was what victory looked like, not just money or legal precedents, but real change that would affect real children for years to come. Tyler's foundation grew rapidly, supported not just by the settlement money, but by donations from people around the country who had been inspired by his story. Within 2 years, the foundation was providing scholarships for hundreds of children annually, and had expanded to monitor discrimination across the entire travel industry. The airline that had once dismissed Tyler's concerns now prominently featured their anti-discrimination efforts in their marketing materials. Their employee training program became a model that other airlines adopted voluntarily. The company that had fought so hard to avoid admitting they had a problem now took pride in leading the industry in civil rights compliance. Linda Johnson, the flight attendant whose actions had started it all, struggled to find work in any customer service industry. Her name had become synonymous with workplace discrimination, and most companies were unwilling to take the risk of hiring her. It was a harsh consequence, but one that served as a warning to others who might consider treating customers unfairly. 5 years after that terrible flight, Tyler was preparing to graduate from high school. He had grown into a confident young man who spoke regularly at civil rights events, and had been accepted to several prestigious colleges with plans to study law like his father. "Do you ever regret that we fought this case so publicly?" Michael asked Tyler one evening as they reviewed college applications together.